Hi, everyone. Today we're going to look at phase changes. If you should need me, my email address is on the screen. I'm rcrawford@jcpsmail.org. Let's hop right in. So a phase change, of course, is just when a substance changes from one state of matter to another. When we talk about states of matter, of course, we're talking about solids, liquids, and gases. Now, as a reminder, phase changes are all physical changes. Why are they physical changes? Because the same substance exists before and after the change. We look at our example here. We have water as a solid, which we call ice. When it changes to a liquid, it's still just water. Okay, and so this is still H2O. Although it's changed its appearance, it's the same substance. It did not change its identity. So remember, these different states are the just different physical forms of the same type of matter. So when we talk about phase changes, I want us to keep in mind the big four. And the big four are phase changes that you have undoubtedly seen and that you have undoubtedly heard of before. And so the first one that I want us to take a look at is I want us to take a look at freezing. So freezing happens when a liquid turns into a solid. Now for this to happen, please notice the lettering is in blue here. That means that it is going to lose or release some heat energy. That liquid has to lose or release heat energy. Okay. If we look at the reverse of that, of course, that is melting. For a solid to melt or turn into a liquid, that is the melting phase change. That means it has to gain heat energy. Now, let's look at liquid to gas. So the first one I want to look at is, once again, I want to look at a gas that is losing heat energy and turning into a liquid. We call that phase change condensation. The reverse of condensation is something called vaporization. That is when a liquid gains heat energy or absorbs heat energy and it turns into a gas. Now, many of you may not be used to calling this phase change from a liquid to a gas. You may not be used to calling that vaporization, but that is the sixth grade term, and I want you to stick with that. Please keep in mind, anytime we're dealing with a phase change, we're talking about either adding heat energy, right? So to move from a solid to a liquid and a liquid to a gas, we have to add heat energy, or maybe we're thinking about removing heat energy, and we would need to move to a gas to a liquid or a liquid to a solid, right? So this is all about adding or losing heat energy. Now, vaporization may not be a term that you have used before. Mostly, some of you guys may have used the terms either evaporation, which you probably learned through the water cycle, or boiling, which is kind of an everyday kitchen term. And so these are evaporation and boiling are two types of vaporization. So let's be able to compare these real quick. Remember, these are still both changes from a liquid to a gas. When we look at evaporation, evaporation is only going to happen at the surface of a liquid. Now, evaporation can happen at very low temperatures. As a result, it happens pretty slowly. You guys have undoubtedly witnessed evaporation before. If you've watched a puddle dry up after a rainstorm on a sunny day, if you've watched clothes drying, you've seen evaporation. Okay, so this happens you only have the change happening at the surface of the liquid. This is at low temperatures and it happens slowly. When we compare that to boiling, we're going to find that boiling happens everywhere within the liquid. And this is because this is happening at a high temperature. This takes a lot of heat energy to make boiling happen. So as a result, because of that higher temperature, boiling also happens very fast. Okay, so two types of vaporization. We have evaporation, which is a slow kind that can happen at low temperatures, and we have boiling, which is a fast kind that can happen at high temperature. So let's go ahead and look at two special phase changes. And the names of these special phase changes are likely to be very new to you. Okay, and I call these special phase changes because they skip our liquid phase. So the first one we're going to look at is when a solid gains heat energy and it goes directly to a gas. This is something we call sublimation. So this is a change from a solid directly to a gas. Notice that it does not go through the liquid state, which is a little unusual. The second kind is the reverse of that, which is something called deposition. Deposition is when a gas turns directly into a solid. And once again, notice that we're skipping this liquid state, and that's why I would call these special phase changes. So when we look at these special phase changes, please note that we are going from here directly to here, no liquid phase, okay? That's kind of the big deal with sublimation and with deposition. So let's look at some examples of each one of these phase changes. The first one we're going to look at is something called melting. So melting, of course, if you see an ice cube and it is disappearing into a liquid, you recognize that immediately as melting. If you see a candle that has a flame attached to it, you're going to see some melting there as well. Lots of times in cooking, anytime you're dealing with cheese, you're going to see melting as a one of those phase changes. Also, though, things that we don't typically think of as being melted, but things like metal. Metals have a higher temperature that they melt at, but that is also an example of melting. On the other hand, if we look at the reverse of that, we're looking at freezing. So anyone who, if you know someone who works with glass, who's into that art, you would absolutely see them melt the glass, and then as it cooled, that's an example of freezing. If you've done any cooking, some of you may have a little container of bacon grease that you keep next in your kitchen next to your stove. When that bacon grease solidifies or turns back into a solid, then we would say that's an example of freezing. Of course, liquid water, we run into examples of it freezing almost everywhere. When lava that's melted rock turns back into solid rock, also an example of freezing. Let's look at a couple of types of vaporization. So clearly, this is the boiling type of vaporization. This is the kind that happens at high temperatures, and it's going to happen throughout the liquid. And so, boiling water on a stove, anything where you have a liquid that you see these air bubbles in. By the way, these air bubbles that we can see, sometimes people think, oh, that's just air. Or these bubbles that we can see, this is just air escaping. This is not air. That is actually water gas or water vapor that is escaping. Because remember, we're turning a liquid into a gas. And so those bubbles that we see are actually water gas or water vapor. Anytime you have water that seems to disappear into thin air, I want you to keep in mind that is usually vaporization. So water disappearing, that is usually some form of vaporization. If you have a puddle drying up, this is an example of vaporization. This is, of course, evaporation. This is going to happen. This is a slow kind. This is not usually at high temperatures. Your hair drying, another form of vaporization, another example. And this is also evaporation. Same thing with clothes drying. So anytime you see water disappearing into thin air, that is usually vaporization. Let's look at some examples of the opposite, which is condensation. You've undoubtedly seen droplets form on the outside of a glass that has ice in it. That's an example of water vapor in the air being cooled down and turning into liquid water. So the key for condensation is if water droplets seem to appear out of thin air, it's usually condensation. Clouds and fog, those are massive changes from a gas to a liquid. And remember that the clouds are and fog are tiny water droplets. So these are both examples of condensation. Shower mirror is also another one. Anytime you can see your breath, which is a lot like fog, that is an example of condensation. And when you wake up sometimes on a summer morning and you see dew or water droplets on the grass, also another form of condensation. All right, guys, that's going to do it for today. I will talk to you again soon, and we'll talk a little bit more about these phase changes.